Okay, morning everybody. Good to be with you today. Before we dive into today's content, are there any questions about the readings or assignments for Module 3? I know we're just getting started on Module 3, so that's okay. A reminder that the written material we're looking at for Module 3 is Chapter 3 of Scott Ray's Moral Choices, and then 2 articles on Schoology, Islam and Social Justice, and 7 themes of Catholic social teaching. So those are your assigned readings for this module. Each day, as we are in the habit of doing, I'll ask you, give you an opportunity to ask any questions. All right, we're continuing, and we won't take a ton of time this morning, but we're continuing the discussion we started yesterday, where my goal is to build some pivotal, some necessary context for Chapter 3 of Scott Ray's Moral Choices. So yesterday's lecture was not a summary of Christian ethics, and it wasn't even a single cohesive story. It was a scattered, here's some context you need for this, here's some context you need for that. There's a couple more topics we're going to build context for, and then we'll call it a day today. What you see here on the screen, this is an excerpt from Chapter 3, and this is the point where Scott Ray begins to actually present his vision of a Christian ethical worldview. We talked yesterday about how diverse the Christian faith is, and how there's hardly a single statement you could make that every Christian on earth would agree with. At the same time, I will say that I find Scott Ray's presentation to be a fairly solid account of Christian ethics that as a whole would be accepted, maybe not in every detail, but as a whole would be accepted by Christians of just about every tradition. That's, I don't take a stance, I'm not endorsing his perspective, but I am saying it's a pretty fair portrayal of a generally acceptable Christian ethic. So this paragraph here is really the heart of Christian ethics for Scott Ray. So let's look at it and then we'll break it down a little bit. Scott Ray says, at its heart, Christian ethics is a blend of both virtues and principles. Morality is ultimately grounded in the character of God. That is, the ultimate source for morality is not God's commands, but God's character. The virtues or character traits, which are made clear by God's character, and further clarified by Jesus' character, are the ultimate foundation for morality from a Christian worldview. God's commands are derived from his character. Already you can see that whatever else Ray is doing, he's not presenting that kind of simplistic, straightforward divine command theory that we critiqued earlier in the course, that he's adding some nuance to things here. God's commands are derived from his character. God issues the commands that he does because he is the kind of God that he is. For example, God commands that we love our neighbors ultimately not because love makes the world go round, though that result is surely a good thing, but because he is that kind of God. In addition, God mandates that we forgive, not primarily because forgiveness restores relationships, though it is certainly true, but because God is fundamentally a forgiving God. The virtues then are primary, and the moral principles, or God's demands, or God's commands, are derived from them. So we could take the first statement here. This is basically Scott Ray's thesis statement about what a specifically Christian ethical worldview is all about. He says, at its heart, Christian ethics is a blend of both virtues and principles. And so since that's the core statement of everything we're talking about this week, and really everything Ray's talking about in his book, because that is his perspective, let's see if we can make some sense out of that. And we're going to do it by drawing an analogy. So if you see the picture here, I've given this picture 2 captions. A mother hugs her child, a mother loves her child. Can anyone see why either or both of those would be an appropriate caption for this picture? I'll take your no response at all as a yes. Now, either of these captions seem to accurately reflect the picture, do they not?
Yeah.
Oh, thank you, Luis. Luis is awake. He gets the awake points today. Sure. Now, of the two statements, amend or tease. Of the two statements, which is the most important? A mother hugs her child or a mother loves her child? Loves her child. Why is that more important?
Because you can give a hug to somebody you hate.
You can give a hug to somebody you hate. You do that a lot?
No, but like I'm saying you could.
Alex, I'm just kidding. I would never hug you. I would never hug you.
You're disgusting.
Okay.
Is it? I'm not saying evil, but can we imagine that there are circumstances where the most prudent, appropriate response from a mother to her child would not be a hug? That there might be circumstances where hugging a child is not the best thing to do in this moment. I'm not saying it would ever be wrong, but it's not the best thing for a mother to do in the moment. Can you think of any scenarios where it wouldn't be the best choice to hug your child?
When the child is showering.
When the child is showering. When the child is having surgery.
Oh.
When the child is 30 years old and she's just broken into your house to steal your television to buy crack.
Okay.
That's a hug is probably not the appropriate response in that moment.
Yeah.
Is there ever a time where it's not appropriate for a mother to love her child? I'm not asking if there are any mothers who don't love their children. You know, the world is not perfect, but is love ever not the appropriate connection between mother and child?
I mean, the
Can
child
you say again?
kills a lot of people.
Child kills a lot of people. So a mother should stop loving her child if he's a mass murderer.
No, not necessarily.
I'm not saying that.
What?
But
I
like,
want you to stop loving me just because.
It'd probably be a lot harder to love a child, but I'm not a mother, and you're not either. And I've seen, that's no, I'm assuming so, right? You're not a mother?
No.
This guy's a real mother. And I'm fired, thank you very much. You know, I've seen the interviews with serial killer mothers. You know, Ted Bundy's mother. He didn't do it, he's innocent, he's a good boy. And she's wrong. He did do it, he's not innocent, and he's not a good boy. We know Ted Bundy. You know, his favorite thing, Sam Harris talked about him. He liked raping and killing. But his mother still loved him. And we're probably happy it wasn't up to her whether he went to prison or not. But is anyone surprised that his mother still loves him? Love is always the appropriate response from a mother to child. Love is not the same thing as enabling. It's not the same thing as supporting decisions. So if I'm stealing my mom's TV because I'm so addicted to crack, she's not required to give me more crack because that's what I want. That's not love. That's not the loving thing. But it would seem that for her to still love me, and for mothers to always love their children, in fact, we could actually restate this. We could restate this as a mother hugs her child because she loves her child. So here it's clear that the loving is primary, and then the secondary action, the hugging, flows out of that. And we can restate this again. The way we're about to restate it, it's going to be a little more wordy and kind of awkward, but it's going to also be more accurate. A mother hugs her child because she is a loving mother. Does that statement make sense? So the action of hug flows out of the very being of the mother. It flows from what the mother is, from her character. Here, the character is primary, and the action is secondary. The action is secondary, and the action flows out of the character. So now, keep the camera pointed in this direction. not just at me, but this side of the room.
Yeah.
So let's look at the thesis statement again. At its heart, Christian ethics is a blend of both virtues and principles. The word virtue here corresponds to is a loving mother. Virtue, remember, virtue ethics is about the character. It's about what kind of person we wish to be. The word principles here corresponds to the action of hugging. So she ought to hug her daughter. It's a deontological principle. It's a duty-based principle. And it's not primary here. What's primary is the virtue-based principle. So we see already that from Scott Ray's perspective, a Christian ethics, at the lead of Christian ethics is virtue ethics. And at the background, coming in to support virtue is deontology. This is what you should do, the principles, the specifics, the particulars. Virtue rules in a Christian ethical worldview, virtue ethics rules. Aristotle would be very happy to find out that although Aristotle was a pagan who worshiped Zeus, didn't believe in him, but worshiped Zeus, he would be very happy to see that the majority religion that would come up later in his culture places his style of ethics at the top. And then deontology, the divine or the rule-based ethics, is in a supportive role. But he's not done. Now, we've been talking about tri-perspectival ethics. Ray's actually going to argue for a quad-perspectival ethic. He's going to say there's not just one, but there are two more ethical systems that are on team Christian ethics. Two more ethical systems that integrate, work together to make up the Christian ethical worldview. So let's look at this expanded statement. Mother hugs her child because she's a loving mother, so the child will grow up feeling safe, which makes the mother feel good. So the child will grow up feeling safe? There's utilitarianism. That's the results-based ethic. And Ray will say there is a place in Christian ethics for results-based ethic. He doesn't give it the first place. He says if your main concern is the results of your actions, you're not really doing Christian ethics. But he's not sending utilitarianism out in the barn and locking it up. Results-based ethics has a place, but a secondary place. So utilitarianism is riding in the back seat, which makes the mother feel good. It's ethical egoism, the self-interest based ethic. There's a room for self-interest in the Christian ethical worldview, but definitely not the dominant place in the worldview. So I've got virtue ethics driving. I've been mixing my metaphors terribly, so we're going to stick with driving now. In Christian ethical worldview, virtue ethics is driving, deontology is riding shotgun, and looking at the map, I just came up with that, but that's because it's rule-based. I'm really good at this, aren't I? Yeah. High five to me. I'd like to congratulate you for being in class with me, ladies. Ew. You made me lose my train of thought. Okay, virtue ethics is driving. Utilitarianism is riding shotgun, holding the map. No. Dang it. Nope. Yes, Steve, thank you. Look what you did. All right, hold on. Virtue ethics is driving. Deontology is riding shotgun, holding the map. Utilitarianism is in the back seat, chiming in, hey, think about it this way. And ethical egoism is in the back seat, but it's asleep. And so every so often, virtue ethics will wake it up, and it will chime in and have something to say about the Christian ethical worldview. I know we just started chapter 3, so you probably haven't got this far yet, but knowing what you know about Scott Ray, there is one approach to ethics that Scott Ray says has absolutely no place in a Christian ethical worldview. Doesn't get to ride in the car. What ethical system do you think that'll be? What's the one he really doesn't want? Pope Benedict said it was a kind of a dictator. Starts with an R. Yeah. The next hint was going to be rhymes with relativism. So.
Relative.
Relativism.
Okay.
According to Scott Ray, relativism has no place in a Christian world ethic. I think a lot of Christians would agree with that. I started poking around in my mind, like, is that really true? Is there no place, without endorsing any of these theories, is a validly Christian ethical worldview have no place for relativism? Well, it surely won't put relativism in the driver's seat. Do whatever you want. That's never been the message of Christianity. But I got thinking, in fact, I was just thinking out loud during second period. So if you've ever read some of the parts in the Gospels where Jesus is coming into conflict with the religious leaders because they want to really strictly interpret the law. This is, the 613 mitzvot we talked about yesterday, the law of Moses. Things like this happen. Jesus will be outside with his apostles and they'll be starving and they'll be exhausted. But it's Saturday, the Sabbath day. And the law of Moses is strict. You cannot do any work, even picking food, on the Sabbath day. It gives very few exceptions, and they're like life and death. Like, somebody breaks his leg, you can help him out of the ditch, and that's it. You do not work on the Sabbath day. Jesus is out with the apostles. It's Saturday. They're next to a field, and they pick just enough grain to eat and keep themselves from passing out from exhaustion and starvation. And the religious leaders pounce on them. How dare you? You blasphemer, you're working on the Sabbath. And Jesus says, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. I could see that as a type of relativism poking in there, where Jesus is saying, you've got to consider the circumstances before, and not just be strict on every rule for rule's sake. But like I said, there's really no case that can be made that relativism is a major theme in Christian ethics. Questions or thoughts about that? So Scott Ray's operating, of course, from within the tradition of Christian faith. And so if we could step into that tradition for the sake of argument, even if it's not our own for a moment. The main purpose of a Christian life from within the tradition of Christian faith, at least as it's expressed in the more ancient and traditional forms of Christianity, the main goal of being a Christian is not just to be saved, as in not going to hell. That's like step one, right? That's the bar. It's not just to be good, but it's ultimately to be transformed. So to have one's character transformed more and more until that character is closer and closer to the character of God, and ultimately until, in some sense, one is transformed into God. This is 2 Peter chapter 1, verses 3 and 4. God's divine power is granted to us all things that pertain to life and godliness through the knowledge of him who called us to his own glory and excellence, by which he has granted to us his precious and very great promises, so that through them you may become partakers of divine nature, and be divinized, be made into God in some mysterious sense, having escaped from the corruption that is in the world because of sinful desire. So here, what's operating is the virtue ethic sort of on steroids. That the real goal of a Christian ethical life is for one's character to be so formed that there is no distinction between who you are and who God is. Okay, one last quick topic, and that'll be our context for the chapter. Other than that one paragraph, sort of thesis statement of Christian ethics, I think the strongest part of Ray's chapter 3 is when he goes through the older Jewish ethics, when he talks about the ethics of the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, minus the part where he uses the word supersession, which we had a whole thing about yesterday. But like cross that sentence out, and the rest of it is really solid stuff. So he looks at how the Old Testament views ethics. And he highlights 3 key themes of ethics in the Old Testament. The first theme is a personal loyalty to God. That one follows the law in the Old Testament. One does all the things one is supposed to do and avoids all of the things that one is supposed to avoid because one is ultimately loyal to one's creator, loyal to the covenant and the relationship that one has with one's creator, and that loyalty makes demands. If you're in a romantic relationship, in a marriage relationship, there are certain things that you do not do because you're loyal to that relationship. Right? And there are other things that are expected of you to do if you were loyal to that relationship. So this personal loyalty to God, that's where we find deontology in the Old Testament. There are things you do and the things you don't do if you were loyal. Second theme is something called holiness. We've probably all heard the word holy. It comes from a Hebrew word that just means something is set apart. So if this bag is holy, it is set aside from all other bags and used only for the most sacred purposes. Old Testament holiness says God has chosen the nation of Israel from out of all other nations, and he is using Israel. He is doing great things in Israel. He's making Israel into something special so that then Israel can then turn and make the rest of the world holy. That's all about forming character. So there's virtue ethics in the Old Testament. And last, the best part of the chapter. So I got to admit something. I don't tell you about my own perspectives, but I have them, which means I have my own biases. And so before I read one page of Scott Ray, I was very skeptical. I had my own biases. And I said, I hope this is not one of those books that treats ethics as if it's all about abortion and gay marriage. That's what I expected. Because of my biases, that's what I expected from Scott Ray. I'm very pleasantly surprised. His material on social justice, on the ethical requirement to care for the poor and the oppressed, the ethical requirement to transform society, to look at not just evil actions, but evil systems, and transform those systems so that the world is actually made better. His emphasis on that is very, very strong. And you find that emphasis especially in the prophets of the Old Testament. So Ray, when he does talk about the topics of abortion and gay marriage, he says what you'll expect him to say. But when he talks about injustice in society, he is not afraid to shine a light on some of the hard truths that the prophets have for everybody, that we've got a responsibility to make this world better. That's a results-based ethic. There's utilitarianism. So there's your tri-perspectival ethics. Deontology, virtue ethic, and utilitarianism, all there in the Old Testament. Any thoughts or questions or anything there? Okay. We can end the video. I need your attention for a couple more minutes. So thank you, Ken.